history. Minutes of history every day. The abolition of the slave trade in Britain. Key points. From the 1770s in Britain, a movement developed to bring the slave trade to an end. This is known as the abolitionist movement. The work of politicians, ordinary workers, women, and the testimonies of formerly enslaved people all contributed to the British abolitionist movement. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act. This ended the buying and selling of enslaved people within the British Empire, but it did not protect those already enslaved. Many enslavers continued to trade illegally. Hundreds of thousands of people remained enslaved. It took a further 30 years of campaigning before slavery was abolished in most British colonies. British campaigners for the abolition of the slave trade. Campaign to abolish the slave trade began in the late 1700s. Several key groups and individuals were involved in the public campaign. Politicians. Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp were leading abolitionists who fought to end slavery. In 1787, they established the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, whose purpose was to campaign for the slave trade to be brought to an end. William Wilberforce was a member of Parliament, and another key figure in the abolitionist movement. Although his proposals met with fierce resistance, from 1789 Wilberforce began to introduce anti-slavery motions in Parliament. He continued to do so until 1807, when the British Parliament introduced the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act. Quakers. 9 of the 12 members of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade were Quakers, formerly known as the Society of Friends. The Quaker Church strongly opposed the slave trade in Britain and America. In 1783, the London Society of Friends sent a petition against the slave trade to the British Parliament. Working class people. Working class people in Britain also played a key role in calling for abolition. Despite benefiting from economic links to the slave trade, many workers in the port cities of Liverpool and Bristol signed petitions that were presented to Parliament. Over 500 petitions, with a combined total of around 390,000 signatures, were submitted in support of Wilberforce's abolition bill in 1792. Formerly enslaved campaigners for the abolition of the slave trade. Enslaved people found ways to demonstrate their resistance. The successful revolts by enslaved people in Barbados, Jamaica, and Demerara shocked the British government. They knew that if enslaved people were not emancipated, large-scale rebellions would continue. In 1838, enslaved people were finally emancipated after many years of fighting for their freedom. The following people were all formerly enslaved. They played a key role in the British abolitionist movement by forming societies, sharing their stories and petitioning Parliament. The journey towards abolition in detail. 1772, the Somerset case. James Somerset had been enslaved as a young man and taken to Virginia. He was bought and sent to London in the 1770s, but he escaped after 2 years. He was captured again and forced onto a ship that was heading for the Caribbean. Somerset asked for the help of Granville Sharp. Sharp used Somerset's situation to test the rights of enslaved people in Britain. He argued that no enslaved person in England could be forcibly moved and resold. In 1772, the judge, Lord Mansfield, ruled that no master ever would adhere to take a slave by force to be sold abroad because he deserted from his service. Therefore the man must be discharged. In this landmark case, James Somerset was granted his freedom and other enslaved people in Britain could not be shipped back to the Caribbean. However, this did not result in emancipation. It wasn't until 1807 that enslaved people in Britain were granted their freedom. 1000 Size and Water Run. 1781, the Zone Case. The Zone was an overcrowded ship that carried enslaved Africans to the Americas in 1781. Due to a navigational error, the ship had to spend an additional 3 days at sea. With supplies and water running out, the crew murdered 131 enslaved people by throwing them overboard. If they had died on board the ship, the crew would not have been able to make an insurance claim for compensation. The case was used by abolitionists such as Olaudah Equiano and Thomas Clarkson in order to highlight the extreme brutality of the traders in enslaved people. 1787, Ottobah Cugoano shares his experiences of enslavement. In 1787, Ottobah Cugoano published his essay Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evils of Slavery. This was the first published critique of the slave trade by an African person. Cugoano's essay served as a powerful testament to the horrors of enslavement. 1780s, primary evidence. In 1789, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade persuaded William Wilberforce to represent them in Parliament. Thomas Clarkson collected information for the committee to present to Parliament and the public. He traveled around Britain, making visits to the ports of Liverpool and Bristol, gathering evidence about the slave trade from eyewitnesses, including from sailors who had worked on slave trading ships. 1789, Olaudah Equiano's autobiography. In 1789, Equiano published his autobiography, which detailed his experiences of enslavement. Equiano embarked on a lecture tour through Ireland, Scotland, and England to share his story. 1792, petitions to Parliament. In 1792, over 519 petitions with thousands of signatures were handed to Parliament. Alongside these petitions, William Wilberforce presented a bill for the abolition of the slave trade every year, from 1789 to 1807. 1791 to 1792, sugar boycotts. From 1791, 1792, 300,000 people, most of whom were women, became involved in the boycotting of sugar and other goods produced using enslaved labor. One of the women involved in the boycotts was Hannah More, a passionate anti-slavery campaigner from Bristol who encouraged other women to join the abolitionist movement. This led to a dramatic decrease in sugar sales, directly affecting the profits of plantation owners. 1804, Haiti becomes a republic. In 1791, a rebellion against enslavement occurred in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. In 1804, Saint-Domingue became the independent Republic of Haiti. Those who used the labor of enslaved people became afraid that rebellions might start to happen more often. These fears became a factor in the eventual decision to abolish the slave trade. The 1807 Abolition of the Slave Trade Act. After over 20 years of campaigning, the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act was passed by the British Parliament in 1807. However, while the act abolished the trade in enslaved people, it did not end the use of enslaved labor across the British Empire. This meant that some people in the Caribbean, and elsewhere in the British Empire, remained enslaved.